Good evening and welcome to this very special event here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. Really proud to see all of you coming out to enjoy, I think, what's going to be a very stimulating discussion about our home, a home that we don't know enough about. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. My host this evening is Jon Lauck, who's a writer and researcher. He's written many books. I've got several of them here that he and I have worked on together on the Midwest, and we're going to explore that. So I'm welcoming you, our live audience, and our C-SPAN viewers everywhere. So Jon, I think we ought to get right into it. Please tell us about your background, and you have real Midwestern roots. I mean, you come by all of this honestly, raised on a Midwestern farm. You know, you went to Big Ten colleges, you know, both for your Ph.D. in history and your law degree. And you've had quite a career in the Midwest. So tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you, Gleaves, and thanks to everyone here in Grand Rapids for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should say that I kind of live in a colony of Grand Rapids in this sense. Of course, the Dutch are very important to Western Michigan and Grand Rapids, but they later chain migrated to Pella and then to Northwest Iowa. Here we go. Of course, my home, or the place I live now, is Sioux Falls, which is right by Sioux Center, Orange City, Iowa. There's a big Dutch enclave right next to our city. And the city of Sioux Falls now has a Dutch mayor who's a very good mayor, very popular. And my kids go to school with lots of vans and lots of other Dutch kids, so I feel right at home here tonight. But thanks again, Gleaves. So yes, I grew up on a Midwestern farm in eastern South Dakota. South Dakota is kind of a divided state. Eastern part of the state's very Midwestern. It's kind of like Iowa and southern Minnesota. The western part, which more people are familiar with, that's kind of the Plains West. That's where the mountains are and the ranchers are and the Indian reservations. That's sort of a different place. That's not very Midwestern. That's kind of a classically Western. Think of Deadwood and the Black Hills. But I'm from the eastern part of the state where most of the people are, and a place that used to be populated with lots of little farms. And my great-grandfathers farmed 160-acre farms, corn, hogs, cattle, very standard Midwestern farms. And that's what my dad was doing when I was born on a farm about 3 or 4 miles south of Madison, South Dakota, if you've ever heard of Madison. Since we're at the Ford Library, you may remember an old guy named Senator Carl Munt. I was thinking of him as I walked in here and saw a picture of Gerald Ford with his pipe, but old Senator Carl Munt was a pipe smoker too. I think with this new book by Richard Norton Smith, maybe we can bring back pipe smoking, a bit of classical America. But then, since I was on a farm, all the farm kids went to the Agricultural College in South Dakota, which is South Dakota State University. It's the land-grant school, and you go there and learn how to be a better farmer. And so, by the way, SDSU Jackrabbits won the National Football Championship this year. If you want to applaud, I'd feel happy to hear that. Please don't confuse them with the North Dakota State University. It's a great insult where I'm from. But so I went to the Ag College and got very interested in history. I had a great professor of history there by the name of John E. Miller. And he was interested in the history of the Midwest. His father was a Lutheran minister, so they moved around to little towns in the Midwest in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois and Kansas. And he really started me thinking about the fact that not many people study the history of this region. So I decided to go to graduate school, applied various places, but ended up at the University of Iowa because there was a guy there who studied things that I was interested in, and went there, got my Ph.D. in history, studied farm economics, wrote a dissertation about agricultural economics in the post-war decades. If you want a sleep aid, I commend that dissertation that turned into a book to you. But when I was in graduate school, it just seemed like the discipline of history and the number of jobs in history was not in good shape. So I decided to go to law school, and I became a lawyer and practiced law for several years. But then this professor that I mentioned decided he was going to retire early and just write books full time. And he said, you should apply for my job at South Dakota State University. And I did. And so I started becoming a history professor and writing books. And that led to these books, many of which are written with the great Gleaves Whitney, who many of you know. He's got a lot of great books himself. And you can tell why we're so simpatico with our interest in history and geography and political philosophy. We're just a sneak peek. We're cooking up a couple of more books that should come out in the next few years.
That's right. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we met, Jon, in 2014. It was at Mecosta. It was in the library at the Russell Kirk Center. And at that time, when we met, I had not heard of you prior to that. And you told me about all the projects. And the reason Jon's imagination sort of captured my attention was that those of us who studied history in the 80s and in the 90s, there was a period when everything was shifting to globalization, or as our colleagues called it back then, globaloney. and so it was fun to find somebody who was actually interested in regional history, local history, state histories, because we had neglected that for decades. And when I found out that Jon was the one who perceived just how big the gap had become between what Midwestern studies had been, state studies and geography and history had been, local histories, kind of a Tocquevillian approach to history, how strong it had been, and the desuetude that it fell into, the neglect. And Jon, you were the one who had the imagination really to see it. Tell us about that process.
Well, so I was teaching at South Dakota State, and if you've ever been in a history department or an academic setting, this may have happened to you. A month before classes started, the chair of the history department came in and said, "Oh, hey, buddy, I forgot. You're supposed to teach the history of South Dakota this fall. The person who was going to teach it is ill or wasn't able to make it to campus." So I scrambled around to put together a course, and I hate to reveal secrets from inside the academy, but sometimes tons of preparation don't go into these courses. But so I put together this course as quickly as I could, and did the best job I could teaching the history of South Dakota. But I noticed that there really was not a good book about early South Dakota, the settlement of the state, the Great Dakota Boom, the territorial period. And so I started making notes and getting organized and ended up writing a book about that phase of South Dakota history. And it was a book that came out under the title Prairie Republic. And one of the things I noticed writing that book is all these people moving into South Dakota, they were coming from the Midwest. If you look at all our early governors in South Dakota, they're from Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin, et cetera. I mentioned I'm from the town of Madison, South Dakota. That was founded by immigrants who came in from Wisconsin. And they thought the county that they were moving into kind of looked like Lake Mendota in Madison, Wisconsin. So they named it Lake County, and they named the town Madison. And that was a very good indication of this chain migration west across the Midwest. And so here's a statistic that should make the point. In South Dakota, 95% of the settlers who were Americans, meaning they had already lived in the United States, they came from the Midwest. South Dakota was not settled by people from Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. It was settled by Midwesterners. Now, there, of course, was a big immigrant group there, too. So we have lots of Norwegians and Germans. Lauck is obviously a German name, and that's, you know, part of the immigrant groups that came from overseas. So I wanted to say something about what does it mean that all these people came in here from the Midwest? There's an old doctrine in geography. There's a geographer named Wilbur Zielinski, and he came up with the doctrine of first effective settlement, meaning the group that ends up in a place and settles that place and plants the dominant culture, that's what the cultural DNA of that place is going to be for many, many decades, maybe centuries. So I wanted to say or explain to people what it meant that Midwesterners were moving into South Dakota. So I thought, well, this will be easy. I will go to the library, I'll read some of the foundational history texts about the Midwest, and I'll read up on this, and I'll write a couple of pieces about it. Well, what I found was there was virtually no books to rely on for getting a sense of what the history of the Midwest was. And I kept digging, and I didn't come up with much. And all of a sudden, I'm like, you know what? This would make a good book. What happened to this field? Why did it vanish? Where did it go? And so I wrote a little book called The Lost Region, toward a revival of Midwestern history that came out in 2013. And that's when Gleaves and I met, and he read this book, and he was super interested in it, and I was trying to revive interest in this region. And, you know, if you're familiar with history at all, you'll know that the history of the American South is a massive field. There are literally dozens and dozens of basic histories of the American South. Same is true of the American West. The American West was a booming field in the 70s and 80s. You may have heard of the New Western History. Most history departments have a Western historian and a Southern historian. Actually, we have a article coming out in the journal I edit, Middle West Review. I'll give you a sneak peek here and kind of give away the punchline for this guy's article. But what it says is, all these universities in the Midwest, they tend to have someone who teaches the history of the American South and the history of the American West, but they don't have anybody who teaches the history of the Midwest, where they're planted. You know, even places like University of Michigan and big 10 universities like University of Minnesota, they don't teach the history of the American Midwest. So that needs to be fixed. And if we can accomplish one thing in all this work we're doing, Gleaves, it's going to be getting someone hired in these bigger Midwestern universities to teach the history of the region that they're a part of. This is not a crazy demand. This is not a radical demand. We're not demanding a revolution or promoting revolution. This is a very simple, small-scale reform that can easily be fixed. Maybe there's someone here on the Michigan Board of Regents who can call up the president of the University of Michigan and make this happen. I don't know.
And also establish the journals. There used to be a lot of Midwestern journals. You've been able to plumb those and get a lot of research out of them. All those journals dried up. They died.
Yeah, they did. And I should say, we did create a new journal of Midwestern history called Middle West Review, created it about 10 years ago, when another consequence of Gleaves and I meeting and this book, The Lost Region, was we launched the Midwestern History Association, which Gleaves very generously hosted here in Grand Rapids. So this is like, you know, the place that the Midwestern History Revival started was here in Grand Rapids. So you should be very proud of that and thank Gleaves for all his work making it happen.
Well, the other thing then that we should cover right away is definitionally, what is the Midwest? There's a lot of confusion. There's amazing confusion about what the Midwest is. But perhaps we could start by defining it in terms of the governing document that the founders left us. Now, it's very interesting. Some people know in 1787, the U.S. Constitution was framed. This is when all the delegates met in Philadelphia over that long, hot summer between May and September, and then September 17th, they signed the Constitution of the United States. At the very same time, up the road in New York, the Northwest Ordinance was being composed. It was signed on July 13th. Jon, talk about the significance of the Northwest Ordinance for what is going to be the Midwest later, because the Northwest Ordinance, and you know this as somebody who got your J.D. at the University of Minnesota, the Northwest Ordinance has still got the organic power of the law of the land. And Michigan's Constitution quotes verbatim out of the Northwest Ordinance. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the creation of the main American Constitution down in Philadelphia gets all the love and attention, and it should. And it's absolutely crucial to American history, and I hope all this work that's being done to revive interest in history and civics in the United States puts a lot of attention on the Constitution. I know you have Gordon Wood coming out here. Everyone here should go hear Gordon Wood talking in Grand Rapids. He is the master. He is the expert on the founding of the country and the writing of the Constitution. So please go hear him. But as Gleave said, up in New York, the Continental Congress was still meeting, and they had to decide what to do with this big chunk of land that they ended up acquiring as part of the American Revolution. Many of you probably know many of the main battles of the American Revolution and what happened on the eastern seaboard, but there's a little-known, unsung aspect of the Revolution, and that is when George Rogers Clark goes out into the West and takes this territory that was then called the Illinois country and what would become Indiana. These used to be old French forts that the British end up acquiring as part of their victory in the French and Indian War. Well, the Americans take it over as part of the Revolution. And so when the Revolution is over and the British have signed over this territory to the Americans have to decide how it will be governed. And this is new territory. This is separate from the original colonies. You know, the colonies started to be organized in the 1600s. And so they had colonial governments, they had colonial governors, they had colonial legislators. They had kind of an infrastructure in place. But for this new territory, which would be west of the Appalachians, north of the Ohio River, so it's called the Northwest Territory, they had to make decisions about how it would be organized and managed. And that summer in New York, they wrote a foundational charter for this territory, which Michigan would be carved out of. And that charter was called the Northwest Ordinance. And it was even more progressive and far-reaching than the federal Constitution in many ways. It included very basic civil rights and habeas corpus and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And, you know, I don't want to gloss over freedom of religion. This is absolutely crucial because some of those early colonies, they were sort of theocracies in a way, like Massachusetts and Connecticut. I mean, those were run by the Puritan Church, and the Puritan Church would dominate those states for many years into the 19th century. I mean, they used to collect taxes to pay for the Puritan Church in Massachusetts into the 1840s. But the Midwest or Northwest Territory would be run differently, and there would be religious pluralism there. All these denominations could openly exercise their religion freely. And so into this territory, you do get Puritan Congregationalists from New England, of course, but you also get Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, and you get upcountry Southerners of various denominations, and you get Germans moving in from Pennsylvania, and you get lots of immigrants who are Lutherans and Catholics. So you get a real mixture of people. The most diverse state in the country in the 1840s was Ohio, whereas these eastern states remained rather ethnologically homogenous. So I'm getting off track here. Back to the Northwest Ordinance. So the Northwest Ordinance is very progressive for its time. It allows new states to be created there. Instead of becoming colonies of the original states, new states are created. They are required to immediately set up schools and make sure that the population is highly literate. But most importantly, I'm going to skip to the end here. The most important thing it did, which the federal Constitution did not do, was ban slavery. Of course, the federal Constitution allowed slavery to continue in the South, and it had the notorious two-thirds clause and other things to protect the institution of slavery. But from the beginning, in the Northwest Territory, it was banned here. And so it meant that these two sections, as they used to say, they didn't use the term regions, those two sections developed differently. And as the 19th century went on, they diverged and went in separate directions, with the South obviously defending to the hilt the institution of slavery. And in the Midwest, many organizations forming to undermine slavery. The efforts to abolish slavery in the abolitionist societies were very powerful, especially in Michigan is a good example. Michigan and Ohio had lots of these societies. So it led to a completely different region than other parts of the United States. And that's why the Northwest Ordinance, which Gleaves loves, he's kind of an expert on this. He's asking me questions about it, but he knows more about it than anybody.
Well, this is fascinating. We'll come back to some of the especially wonderful features of the Northwest Ordinance and the promotion of education. And we were just mentioning Annette Kirk and the Russell Kirk Center a few minutes ago. I mean, school section Lake up there is right in the middle, section 16, right in the middle of these townships. You had sections devoted to education, really remarkable. And this is just an illustration of how progressive the Midwest was. We don't think of the Midwest as in world historical significance as being a progressive area of the world, and yet it was. And a lot of that goes back to the wisdom of the founders. Just a footnote, you know, when you had the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, and you had John Adams, the Adamsians, get together, and their surrogates and they themselves contributed to what the Northwest Ordinance would be. Isn't it interesting that Jefferson eschewed, rejected slavery? The Jeffersonians in this process rejected slavery for this territory. But let's go to now defining the Midwest. We have written or edited together a number of books, you know, North Country, trying to figure out where the Midwest sort of blends into what becomes the North. Interior Borderlands was a wonderfully fun book to work on, where the Midwest sort of glides into the Great Plains. We're currently finishing up another book which sort of looks at the East, you know, where the Midwest begins. That's sort of what David McCullough takes up in his last great book, The Pioneers, which I recommend to everybody to read about the origins of sort of the Midwestern ethos and how we have a civic ethos, which is much different from that in the East and in the South. So what is the Midwest then, and what has it become now?
I'll get to that in 1 second. I just want to follow up on the David McCullough comment. His last book, and I think McCullough's kind of an honorary Midwesterner. He grew up in Pittsburgh, right on the borderlands there. But I think ever since he was a young man, he wanted to write a book about how those two rivers come together in Pittsburgh, form the Ohio River that goes down and shapes the southern boundary of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. So I think late in life, he said, I've been meaning to do this my whole life. And it's a very special book. Highly recommend it to you. And it explains a lot about the Northwest Ordinance and its importance to the shaping of the early Midwest. I would also say that our journal, or the journal I edit, called Middle West Review, which is based at the University of South Dakota, we really strive to have a wide variety of voices in that journal, unlike some journals. And we did a symposium about David McCullough's book, and 6 or 7 experts from many different persuasions and angles analyzed that book. And it's a great exercise. If you're a university professor, you can assign David McCullough's book about early Ohio and then assign all these commentaries about the book, and I've done that, and it's worked great in the past. I was also going to flash this book. So when Gleaves very generously hosted that first Midwestern History Conference here in Grand Rapids in 2014, we selected some of the best lectures from that, and it became this book, University of Nebraska Press published, Finding a New Midwestern History. And this is definitely one of the foundational books of the revived field. So, also one quick comment on literacy and the Northwest Territory. I don't think we can exaggerate this at all. By the end of the 19th century, in the Midwest, you have literacy rates of 95% in Minnesota and Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska, et cetera. That's an amazing number. And you compare that to the literacy rates to the monarchies of Europe, et cetera, where, they deliberately tried to keep people uneducated and illiterate so they couldn't organize and threaten their governments. Places in the United States, like the Midwest, the Little Red Schoolhouse was, every 5 miles out in the country. And this was a sign of progress and democratic development, and it was very much something they took pride in. The other thing about the literacy rates is one of the chapters in my book is about race, and there are certain things in early Midwestern history that need to be understood and tackled and talked about when it comes to discrimination and racism. However, on this question of literacy, black children in the Midwest started to be educated in the 1820s and 1830s. There was integrated education in the Midwest in the 1840s and 1850s. There were 120 integrated schools in Ohio by 1850. I mean, these are things that most people don't know. I think most people assume that there was discrimination and segregation in schooling throughout the 19th century. That's not accurate. It was commonplace in the Midwest. Think of it this way. Illiteracy was a huge problem in the American South, extending way into the 20th century. There were more African American kids educated and literate in the Midwest than there were white kids in the American South. That's a pretty amazing statistic, and it really shows the regional divergence between the Midwest and the American South and why they were so different. All right, back to Gleaves's question about the boundaries of the Midwest. So there is a very common understanding of the Midwest as 12 states: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska. I think that's 12. But state boundaries don't tell the entire story. You need to dig a little deeper and sand off some of these edges. For example, where I'm from in South Dakota, as I mentioned to you, it's a bifurcated state. So west of the Missouri River, that's the Plains West. East of the Missouri River, that's very Midwestern. And Gleaves and I were part of a book exploring this called the interior borderlands, meaning the borderlands inside our country that divide regions. If you want to think of it in technical terms, the 100th meridian, or if some people think it's the 98th meridian, but roughly where the Missouri River divides the Dakotas, that is the divide between the Midwest and the West through the Dakotas. Now, what about the southern tier? The Ohio River is the standard boundary separating Ohio and Indiana and Illinois from Kentucky, slave Kentucky. But you could say that that southern tier of counties in these Midwestern states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, those are kind of southern because the southern influence extends over the river a little bit. Anybody ever been to Cairo, Illinois? Yeah. I mean, Cairo, Illinois has a real southern flavor to it. If you look at a map, that southern tip of Illinois, it juts way down into the American South. It's further south than the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And if you go there, it has a definite southern flavor. I ran across an old memo written by a young staffer named Dick Durbin. Now he's the senator from Illinois, but back then he was a staffer to Paul Simon, Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, who ran newspapers in the southern half of Illinois. And they were talking about how southern the town of Cairo is. And so the memo was written to Senator Simon. When you get there, don't act like this is Chicago, because it's not. This is kind of little Kentucky. Another side note on that, if you ever read that book Barack Obama wrote, I think it was the second one, about him running for president. There's a chapter in there about him running for the Senate from Illinois. And his staffers are like, well, you're from Chicago, things are a little different down in Cairo. You might not be welcomed with open arms. And he went down there and did a campaign swing when he was running for the Senate. And it went great, and it was a very festive atmosphere, very welcoming. But some of the old-timers of Illinois politics were saying, this is not how it used to be in Cairo. So another side note, if you have ever if you've been reading up on CRT and critical race theory and whiteness studies, etc., well, kind of the person who came up with that whole idea, David Rediger, his parents are from Cairo, Illinois. So when you're reading his books, you can get a sense of what he's talking about. He's talking about his experience in Cairo, which really isn't the rest of the Midwest. He's kind of his views are kind of distorted by where he comes from. There's a long interview of him in our most recent issue of Middle West Review, which is very revealing about his early days in St. Louis and East St. Louis and Cairo. But what I'm getting at is, in the Midwest, there's a lot of sub-regional variation. Not all places are the same. The northern reaches of the Midwest, which Gleaves and I are going to be launching this book this week at the Midwestern History Association here in Grand Rapids. Well, this is about the upper reaches. We're in Michigan here. You've been to the UP, Upper Peninsula, Michigan. It's different. Right? I mean, this is a place of mining and forests and shipping and lumberjacks and stuff. It's not like the traditional core corn and hogs, small town Midwest. So, and that's one of the fun things about this field, is exploring all these regional variations. All right. On the eastern side, there's obviously a divide where Appalachia ends, eastern Ohio, places like that. And Gleaves and I are working on a book on that, so we'll save a bigger discussion on that for when that comes out.
I just wanted to point out that one of the authors in this book just walked into the auditorium, and I'll leave it to you to look for this and read a delightful chapter called, the exact title is The Mysterious Migration of a Marvelous Mastodon. So good job with that. And it's one of I think, the most fun chapters in all of this series of books. It's a very different take. Well, we've talked about the ironic progressivism, it seems, because today the perception of the Midwest is that it's filled with rubes. It's a red state, sort of hickish, backwater to the coasties who on the East Coast, the West Coast, where all the cultural action is, where people are finely educated. And yet, of course, the Midwest, you've structured your book to talk about the Midwest in the long 19th century. Now, historians have a way of talking about the 19th century which sort of defies strict chronology. Usually take it from, say, the French Revolution to World War I. So that's about 120 years or so. And if you take that long 19th century, which is the focus of this book, The Good Country, you show again and again by your method in this book that the Midwest is not only farther ahead of other regions of the United States in its progressive politics and sensibilities and its ethos, but it's ahead of other regions of the most advanced industrial countries in the world. It's fascinating. Talk about a little bit about just what the Midwest contributed to our world in the long 19th century. And then after that, let's talk a little bit about what happened. What happened in the 20th century where there seems to be this revolt against the Midwest and the village. And I'm setting it up so that you have time now to start thinking of the questions you would like to put to Jon about the Midwest. So if you want to take the first, the long 19th century.
Well, I will confess to all of you that my original intent was not to simply focus on the long 19th century, but as I got started on this book and I entered chapter 5, I'm like, this thing's way too long already. And I have so much left to cover that, I hope to do kind of a broad view history of the Midwest to the present. But by the time I got to 1900, I had to draw the line. I do think that's a logical place to draw the line, however, because by the end of the 19th century, new things begin to happen. There's a new wave of mass migration. There's industrialization of some of these places that become major cities in the Midwest. And you get, the rise of airplanes and mass communications, et cetera. So it begins to change a little bit. So it's a logical dividing line. But back to your question about how the Midwest outpaced other regions, let me just bring up the question of women and women's rights, which I think is a good example of this. And I try to go through a bunch of different examples in the book. But we had in our journal, Middle West Review, a cover story, I think 3 issues ago, about how the Midwest embraced women's rights in terms of voting much earlier than other regions. And then more recently, we had an issue about how the Midwest was where co-education began, meaning where women could go to college. And if you look back at the records of these early denominational colleges in Ohio and Michigan and other places, this is the first place that women are allowed to go to college in the 1830s and the 1840s. I remember reading this stat one day, and I had to double check it. I couldn't believe it, because in 1870, there were about 100 female doctors, medical doctors in the state of Ohio. I was like, wow, that seems like a very large number. By the end of the century, there were 500 female doctors in the state of Ohio. And a lot of it started with women's civic activism on the town level, where they were very involved in clubs. Civic clubs were very prominent. And I give some examples from various towns, a couple of towns in Michigan in the book. But if you got involved in these civic clubs, pretty soon you were involved in various social causes. Prohibition would be a big one, where women were highly influential. But there are a lot of other causes that were smaller, geared toward the town, beautification campaigns, clean up the river campaigns, build a park, build a library. Women in the Midwest were the tip of the spear when it comes to the building of thousands of libraries, which is one of the reasons the literacy rates were so high in the Midwest. So a lot of people think about women's voting rights coming in 1920, which they did on a national level, a universal level. But there were a lot of steps along the way. In the Midwest, women were given the right to vote in municipal elections, in county elections, and school board elections, many years, many decades prior to the 1920 decision. There were female mayors of Kansas towns in the 1860s because women could run for office in municipalities and in school boards. And this is not how we think of it. We tend to, and this has to do with the Northeastern bias of our history books. They don't talk about what was going on in the Midwest. Lawyers, another good example. Women were going to law school in the Midwest in the 1860s and the 1870s. These were the first women lawyers. Anybody know when Harvard Law School was open to women? 1950. 80 years later. So this is a huge regional divide that has been lost to the mists of time because the people that tend to write our history tend to be located in the Midwest and kind of overlook what happened in the interior. So I would commend to you these sections of the book about how life diverged between the Midwest and the Northeast and the South.
And so that goes to the segues to the next and the last question that I want to put to you, because I want to give you all the opportunity to put your questions to Jon while we've got you here. So what happened? I mean, after this great progressive series of reforms, and the Midwest is setting the pace really for the rest of the country and the world, what happened? Where the bloom fell off the bush, and how did that?
Well, I am still thinking about this, and I want to pull together my thoughts probably in a book down the road. But one of the things that happened was in the 1920s, some smart aleck wrote an article in The Nation magazine called "The Revolt from the Village." And what he claimed in this article is that all of these writers out in the Midwest were finally pulling back the curtain on how backward and retrograde the region was. And he pointed to Sinclair Lewis, and he pointed to Edgar Lee Masters and Sherwood Anderson and F. Scott Fitzgerald and people like that. And I actually taught this idea in my classes on American history for many years. And then one day I decided, I'm going to dig in and peel back the layers of the onion on this revolt from the village idea. And what I discovered was this is totally wrong. All of these authors actually specifically wrote articles or made statements condemning this author for claiming this revolt from the village took place. And they actually were great defenders of their home place. Now, a lot of people have this sense that Sinclair Lewis was attacking his little town in Minnesota. Not really. If you read Main Street, How I Think It Should Be Written, his famous novel, I think he's really mostly making fun of the outsiders who come in and try to change the little town. At least that's my reading of it, which I've written about at length. If you want to know where we kind of went wrong, we took a wrong turn on all this. My book, From Warm Center to Ragged Edge, I go into this in great detail. From Warm Center to Ragged Edge is a line from Fitzgerald from The Great Gatsby, you may recall. And what is Fitzgerald saying with that line? He's talking about finally leaving the craziness of Manhattan and New York and everything he saw there and going back to the warm center of the world in Minnesota where he grew up. That's what Fitzgerald was getting at. Unfortunately, Fitzgerald and some of these other writers, their works have been twisted in ways that distorts their meaning. And I think we need to get back to the proper reading of these novels and the proper understanding, because it's one of the great scams of history and literary history and cultural life, that people have turned these books against the Midwest when that's not how they should be read. So I think that's one thing that happened, Gleaves. There's a lot of other things. I mean, the coming of mass culture in the 20th century, which had a very damaging effect on regional culture and regional writers. I mean, that undermined the distinctiveness of the region. I think first industrialization and then the painful unwinding of that through deindustrialization. You know, the growth of other regions in the country, like California. In 1900, where I end this book, and I end the book during the Midwestern moment, as I call it, or this prominent period for the Midwest in American history, when it was the biggest region, had the most people. At the end of the 1800s, Michigan was bigger in population than California. And of course, that changed in the 20th century. There's 40 million people in California now. So we get overshadowed, and that became a cultural center, and that became where our movies are made and where our culture is generated. And unfortunately, less of it is made in the Midwest now. Even our big newspapers, which used to be cultural arbiters and trendsetters, like the Chicago Tribune, used to be a major, powerful force. I've been reading the new biography of Gerald Ford by Richard Norton Smith, and he talks about the power of regional newspapers. Well, a lot of these newspapers are barely hanging on, and so they have no power to exert the cultural influence of this region like they used to. And so culture in this country tends to happen on the coast in New York and LA. And what I'm trying to do, and what Gleaves is trying to do, and some of the people that are part of this effort to revive Midwestern studies, is to give the Midwest a stronger and louder voice in American national affairs. And I'd love your help making that possible.
Got it. How about questions from out? Yeah, go ahead and give them a hand. Absolutely. Sir?
I believe that there were a number of people here in the Midwest who were here before all of us started arriving. And I wonder where they fit in with this renaissance of the study of the Midwest and its history.
Well, one of the great things to report from the field is that there is a booming field of Native American studies that started probably in the 70s. Some of you may remember this very important book called The Middle Ground about Native American history of the Midwest, written by Richard White, who's gone on to many great things in the historical profession. But he wrote that when he was a young professor up in East Lansing at Michigan State University. And that was definitely one of the signposts on this road to a great deal of work on Native American history. And all this history that took place with the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, the British occupation of this part of the country, the early American period in the 1790s where there were all those wars involving General St. Clair and the Native American groups. I mean, there is an extremely large historiography about what happened there. And in the book, I point people in the direction of that historiography, which is very, very important. Where I try to pick up the story is in about 1800, when a lot of those questions and a lot of that history about what happened to the early peoples is kind of over. But what comes after, no one has really written much about. So that's where I pick up the story.
Another question.
Does it trouble you that the Big Ten Conference, which was always a quintessential Midwestern institution, now has Penn State, Rutgers, Maryland, and about to have USC and UCLA?
It does bother me. It's outrageous. It's ridiculous that Rutgers is in the Big Ten. Terrible decision. Now bringing in the California schools is even worse. I was thinking about this when I was finishing the Richard Norton Smith book about Gerald Ford, and I love this story. In the 1976 presidential race against Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford signs up a lot of these football legends to help him on the campaign. And one of them is Woody Hayes of Ohio State. And he wants to help out Gerald Ford and stuff, but he calls Gerald Ford on the phone and says, I'll help you because I want you to be president because you're a great man, but I will not say anything nice about Michigan. No, I hope we can undo this terrible decision to widen the Big Ten. It should be a Midwestern conference, I agree.
Hear, hear. Another question.
Yes, you have talked a lot about the progressive nature of education in the Midwest. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the land-grant universities. Was this unique just in the Northwest? Did it also spread in other parts of the country?
Well, it's unique in an important sense. Well, first of all, Ohio State, South Dakota State, Michigan State, University of Minnesota, these are all land-grant schools. Very important for our part of the country. These are obviously huge research universities, have a lot of influence in the region. One of the greatest ideas that came out of the Midwest. Remember, that land-grant bill passed Congress after all the Southerners left because of the Civil War. And these Midwesterners who had been pushing it for a while, all of a sudden they're like, great, all the Southerners are gone, we can pass this through Congress. And Abraham Lincoln, who has not been mentioned tonight and should have been, probably the prototypical Midwesterner, he eagerly signed that into law. Now, in the South, I hope I have this history right, but in the South, those institutions had to be split into African American colleges and into white colleges. And so you have a whole different system developing in the South. And I should have mentioned this in terms of the racial integration of Midwestern colleges. Again, that starts in the 1830s. Places like Antioch College and Oberlin and Ohio University, they're matriculating black students very early on. And these Big Ten schools that we were just talking about that become big research institutions, they're desegregated from the beginning. And that's another great aspect of Midwestern history that people don't talk about. There's some great stories in the 20th century when University of Minnesota, and there's probably a Michigan angle on this too, but I remember University of Minnesota, University of Iowa, they were asked to go to Louisiana to play LSU. And of course, the rule if you went to Louisiana was you can't bring any black players. And these Big Ten schools would object, and they would say, there's no way we're doing that. We're bringing all our players. And so this became a real friction in like the 1930s and 40s when these Midwestern schools were playing Southern schools.
Another question? Yes, back row, almost the back row.
I was wondering, when I drive around, I often see buildings that I understand to be from the Grange movement, and I was thinking, could you talk a little bit more about that here in the Midwest?
Yeah, so there's a guy named Oliver Kelly from Minnesota that started the Grange movement, and he modeled it on the Masonic lodges and Masonic temples because there was a dense civic culture in the Midwest. It was a culture of joining, lots of little clubs. many of us would be familiar with the Masons and more recently probably the Kiwanis and the Lions and Rotary. But there were also clubs that were very specific to particular towns. I was thinking again about this when I was reading the Gerald Ford biography too, because Richard Norton Smith says in the beginning of that book, when this young lawyer is starting off in Grand Rapids, Gerald Ford was a member of 13 clubs. I mean, that's a great example of this civic culture in the Midwest. And not just the Rotarians and not just the Lions and the Kiwanis. He was a member of the Kent County Farm Bureau. He was a member of the NAACP here. He was, what were some of these other clubs? But I'm like, this is very stereotypically Midwestern. And, Gerald Ford, we're right here in the home of Gerald Ford. This is a great place to think about these things. And he is a great representative of Midwestern culture. He comes out of that culture. He represents it well. But anyway, so the Grange is a farm organization started in Minnesota in the 1870s. It spreads throughout the Midwest, and it is able to succeed and take off very quickly because of the existing civic infrastructure that is already here. And then after that, farmers' alliances begin to form. This later on morphs into the Populist Party in some places. But the Populists are more active in the South and on the plains. The Populists were less successful in the Midwest because they already had a lot of influence, agricultural influence, via the alliance, etc. So yes, I do have a section in the book on the importance of these agrarian societies and these agrarian clubs, because let's face it, most of the 19th century that I'm talking about here, the rural Midwest is made up of farmers. In the 1880s and 1890s, still 80 and 90% of most of these states are farmers, small towns and farmers.
You ever heard of the book by Johanna Stratton, I think is her name, Pioneer Women, that was published in 1981? And she got stories that I think from her grandmother's attic or her great-grandmother's friends wrote stories, the women that started out in the East Coast but went into the Midwest to settle the Midwest. And have you ever read Giants in the Earth by Rolvog, I think? That's another fascinating book.
Well, oddly enough, I live about 6 blocks from the Rolvog cabin. So Ole Rolvog, his family migrated over to the Dakotas from Norway, I guess in the 1870s or 1880s. And he became educated, became literate, which the peasants in Norway weren't necessarily, it was still kind of a monarchical, aristocratic society in Norway. He becomes educated and becomes a writer and writes about the experience of all these Norwegian immigrants into especially the western part of the Midwest, and talks about their struggles and how hard they worked and the difficulties of settling out on the prairie. Kind of a grim book in some ways. You know, Barrett has a lot of problems. Perhansa freezes in the Dakota winter. You know, this is it wasn't easy. These people worked hard, and they struggled to build a society that they were very proud of. One of the chapter titles in Giants in the Earth is "The Plains Drink the Blood of the Christian Man," or something like that. I mean, it's very, but he's trying to make the point about the struggles of these Norwegian immigrants. But the Norwegian immigrants are an extremely successful immigrant group. They become very active in civic affairs, and they start getting elected to, local offices and to state government and to and governors and senators and stuff. I think there was a Norwegian congressman elected from Minnesota in 1872. When South Dakota became a state, it had a Norwegian governor. I mean, these are right off the boat immigrants. This is not, you know, your typical immigrant experience. My wife is a Norwegian, so we, in the wintertime, will go down to the Sons of Norway Hall in South Dakota for, what is that fish they eat?
Yes.
Torsk? Is it torsk? Is that right? Lutefisk. Okay, yeah. We go to the lutefisk feed at the Sons of Norway Hall. So in my part of the Midwest, lots of Norwegians.
That's great. We have time for a couple more questions. Okay, can we get a microphone here in the middle?
I can speak loudly.
Well, we're on C-SPAN, so let's get a microphone there.
What role did faith and organized religion play in the development of the strength of the Midwest?
It was extremely important. Probably the first thing settlers did when they began to organize a community was to build a church. And soon after that, they organized the main street and put in dry goods stores. And soon after that, they built a school. But no, it was foundational to life in the Midwest. What made it different was the mixture of denominations here, which made it very religiously diverse, and unlike some of the other colonies. Because, you know, if you think of colonial Virginia, it was the Episcopalians that dominated that state. If you think of New England, obviously dominated by the Congregational Church. But you get out here into the Midwest, it's all jumbled up, a real mixture of religions. And so in a lot of early Midwestern communities, you have a lot of cooperation among denominations. So they'll build one church, and then the Presbyterians can go there on Sunday morning, and the Methodists can go there Sunday noon, and in the afternoon, they'd let the Lutherans in, you know, until everyone could get established and get their own churches going. So, no, it's foundational to Midwestern settlement.
Well, and that's, again, to go back to the Northwest Ordinance in Article 3, which says religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. It is more explicit about religion than either the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution that came out the same year, or what's written about in the Federalist Papers often. I mean, it's really quite distinct. And then Article 1 guarantees this religious pluralism. There's no requirement that you be a certain kind of Christian. The same, it's just exactly what you said earlier. Massachusetts and Connecticut, in the 1830s, they are still established churches in those states, but not in the Midwest. I mean, we were way ahead of time, but it shows how important religion was. But you could come here and be the believer you wanted to be, as opposed to having the state trying to impose it on you, a certain kind of faith.
If I could commend something to you, in this book, Finding a New Midwestern History, Gleaves and I were very lucky to recruit the Yale historian John Butler to write a chapter about religion in the Midwest. It's extremely well done, but one of the things he emphasizes is how diverse the denominations were and the degree of cooperation, et cetera. Oddly enough, I was at a high school graduation on Sunday at a little Dutch church in Sioux Falls, by the way, and I was talking to a guy from Renville, Minnesota, which is the home of John Butler. John Butler grew up there, and so I've heard him talk about how, you know, these churches would develop in Midwestern towns, especially in our part of the country. There would be, you know, a Wisconsin Synod church that the Swedes had, and there would be a Missouri Synod church that the Germans had, and then there would be another Lutheran Synod church, and, you know, there'd be different varieties based on the ethnic groups of the area. But I think it's safe to say that I would say, premier historian of American religion, John Butler, is from a little town in the Midwest and contributed to this book and has thought about it a lot. So if you want to dive in, I'd start with that chapter.
One last question. Yes, sir.
Religion and schools and the various cultures all kind of came to a head in a book by Tom Brokaw, Neighbor Years.
Tom Brokaw, yeah. Yes. Which book is it? Do you have that book here, Gleaves? I'm very proud to have a blurb from Tom Brokaw on the back of one of these books because he grew up in South Dakota, out in Pickstown. You know, he's supposed to have a book coming out in the next couple of months about growing up in South Dakota. So watch out for that. He's a very, very nice guy. He is in real life, you know, everything he seems to be on TV. I would say this may be a good way to end it. Tom Brokaw, when he retired, you know, he used to be on Morning Joe and some of these shows, and he would give his commentary in the morning, and then he officially retired about 2 years ago. And as he was signing off, one of the things he said, and remember, he was in New York, he was at NBC News, he was the nightly anchor, he was in the middle of everything for decades. And one of the things he said was that the news media and our culture in this country is completely dominated by the coasts. And these people that are in 30 Rock beaming these news stories out to the rest of the country don't understand the rest of the country. They understand Manhattan and they understand Los Angeles. And so take it from Tom Brokaw. We need stronger cultural institutions in the Midwest. We need stronger newspapers here. We need more journals and magazines and books that are talking about our history. So remember this. You need to understand your own history and your own identity and the region you're from, because if you don't, someone else is going to tell you what your history is, and they don't have your best interests at heart. They don't really necessarily care about accuracy. They may buy into the whole revolt from the village malarkey. So please support things like your local libraries and your local museums and cultural organizations like the Midwestern History Association, and, you know, carry on this civic legacy that Gerald Ford and many other Midwesterners represented. So thanks for hearing us out.
Thank you very much. You had the opportunity to put questions to Jon. I have two questions for you. Did you learn tonight? Yes, absolutely. And second, did this presentation make you prouder of being a Midwesterner? Yeah, all right. That's great. That's great. And I'm a transplant from Texas, and I'm proud to be a Midwesterner now. Okay, well, I want to thank just a few people and recognize a few people. First of all, we so appreciate it. We have members of the Ford family here, Bob and Karen. We always appreciate your being here and representing Uncle Jerry and Aunt Betty.
All right.
Thanks for being here. We have a trustee from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation who is here, co-chair Hank Meyer. Thank you so much for being here. And we always want to thank our great partner, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, for being just wonderful hosts of these events. They always do a beautiful job in this great facility. So thanks to, I saw Joel Westfall here earlier. Thanks to him, and thanks also to Brooke Clement for their hospitality always for these gatherings. Well, with that, then I think, Jon, there's some books. We have The Good Country in the bookstore, and I'm sure people have books they would like for you to sign. So let's adjourn and get to it. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.